The dressing room at Madison Square Garden smelled like cigarette smoke and something floral that someone had tried to use to cover the cigarette smoke and hadn't. It was October 1974, and the show was scheduled to begin in 85 minutes. Marvin Gaye sat in the chair in front of the mirror and looked at himself without really looking at himself. His eyes were open. That was about all that could be said for them. The costume was on the hook behind him. He could see it in the reflection. A tailored dark suit, the kind of thing that looked effortless on a man who had everything together. Motown's stylist had chosen it. Someone had pressed it, hung it there with the expectation that Marvin would simply put it on and walk out the door, like a man who had been doing exactly this for years. And he had been. That was the problem. He had been doing this for so long that the motion of getting dressed for a stage felt like preparing for something he no longer believed in. He hadn't performed live in 4 years. Not since Tammi. He didn't think the name so much as feel it, the way you feel a bruise when you press your fingers into it without meaning to. He hadn't said her name out loud to anyone in months. There was nothing to say. You couldn't explain what it meant to stand in front of 40,000 people and sing about love to a woman who was dead. You couldn't explain what it meant to hear your own voice come out of the speakers and know that the voice on the other side of that harmony was gone. You just carried it. You carried it everywhere you went, and you got very good at keeping your face still while you did. His road manager knocked twice and opened the door without waiting. He said something about the schedule, about sound check running long, about whether Marvin had eaten. Marvin told him he was fine. The man looked at the untouched food on the table, at the costume still on the hook, at Marvin still in his street clothes, and he had the good sense not to say anything else. He closed the door. 3 rooms down the corridor, Diana Ross was already dressed. He knew this because he had passed her door 20 minutes earlier on the way back from the bathroom, and he had heard her voice through the wall. Not singing, just talking, that precise and calibrated way she had of speaking that made everything sound like a decision. Diana always sounded like she had already decided. It was something he had noticed about her years ago, back when they were both younger, and Motown was still something you believed in without reservation. She moved through the world as if she had written the terms in advance, and everyone else was simply catching up. He had always admired that about her. He had also always found it slightly exhausting. Tonight was supposed to be his night, his return. The promotional materials had been careful about that framing. Marvin Gaye, live at Madison Square Garden, 4 years after stepping away from the stage. Diana was listed as a special guest, which in the language of the music industry meant she would appear briefly, add her name to the night's wait, and the combination of the two of them in one building would generate the kind of anticipation that filled a venue twice over. Marvin had agreed to all of it when it was still an abstraction. Agreements made months in advance feel different from the reality of 85 minutes in a costume on a hook. He picked up the jacket. He put it down. He looked at the mirror again. The face looking back at him was 35 years old, and it looked like it knew things a face shouldn't have to know that young. There were people who found this beautiful. He had never found it beautiful. He had found it tiring, mostly. The permanent weight of looking like a man carrying something. He was still sitting there when the knock came. Not his road manager this time. The knock was different, lighter, deliberate in a different way. He said, "Come in," without thinking. Diana Ross opened the door and stood in the frame of it. She was wearing something long and dark, and she had the look of a woman who had assessed the situation in the half-second before stepping into the room and had already adjusted her approach accordingly. She looked at the costume on the hook. She looked at Marvin in his street clothes. She didn't say anything about either. "I wanted to go over the arrangement," she said. "There's no arrangement," Marvin said. "You do your set, I do mine. I thought we might do something together." She said it like it was a practical suggestion, the way you'd suggest taking a different route through traffic. At the end, "One song." Marvin looked at her. "That wasn't discussed." "I'm discussing it now." He should have said no. The word was in his mouth, reasonable and ready, because he had spent 4 years building walls around the particular kind of exposure that came with sharing a stage with someone, with standing next to a body that was not Tammy's body, and singing words that he and Tammi had made into something sacred. He should have said no, and they would have had separate triumphant nights and gone back to their separate, careful lives. Instead, he said, "What song?" Diana looked at him for a moment. "You know what song," she said. He did know, and she knew he knew. And they both sat inside that knowledge for a second longer than was comfortable before Diana said she'd see him on the other side and closed the door behind her. The corridor went quiet. Marvin put on the suit. The first 40 minutes of the show were something close to what he remembered performing feeling like, back before everything collapsed. The Garden was electric in the way that only New York audiences can be electric. That particular density of attention, 30,000 people leaning forward at the same time, the air itself changing quality. He moved through the set carefully, choosing songs that kept him at a certain distance from his own feelings, arrangements that gave him technical problems to solve rather than emotional ones to inhabit. His voice was in good shape, better than he'd expected, honestly. There were moments in the first three songs where he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time, and then he looked at the side of the stage and saw Diana standing in the wings. She wasn't doing anything. She was just standing there in the dark at the edge of the light, watching him, and she had the stillness of a person who had been in enough wings of enough stages to know exactly how to make herself invisible when she needed to. But he could see her, and seeing her standing there in the place where, 4 years ago on a different stage in a different city, Tammi had stood waiting to make her entrance. The tightness came back. It came back fast and it came back hard, and he turned away from the wings and faced the audience and kept singing. He sang for 40 minutes. He did not look at the wings again. When the moment came, there was no announcement, no introduction. The band shifted into a new groove, something slower and more open, and Diana Ross walked out of the dark and into the light, and the Garden lost its mind. The sound that came out of 30,000 people simultaneously recognizing what was happening was the kind of sound that exists in very few places in the world. Genuine shock converting instantly into joy. The specific electricity of an audience realizing they are witnessing something unplanned, something real. Marvin turned to face her. Diana looked at him with an expression that was warm and professional, and also, underneath those things, something quieter. Something that said, "I see you." Not the performance, not the suit, not the careful distance you've been maintaining for 4 years. I see the thing underneath. He thought about Tammi. He thought about a stage in Virginia in 1967 and a woman whose legs gave out beneath her in the middle of a song, and how he had caught her before she hit the floor, and how that had been the last time he'd felt like catching someone had been enough. Since then, the feeling had been that you could catch a person and still lose them. You could be present at every moment and still end up standing alone in a dressing room 4 years later with a suit on a hook. The music started. It was Ain't No Mountain High Enough, and it was the most obvious choice and the only possible choice, and both of them knew it. The first notes came out of the speakers, and Marvin felt the word go through the room like a current. Recognition, memory, the specific grief that attaches itself to songs that used to mean something different. He sang. Diana sang. Their voices found each other the way voices do when two people have been living inside the same musical language long enough. Not effortlessly, but inevitably. There were rough edges. There were moments where Marvin's voice went somewhere Diana didn't follow, and moments where Diana's precision made Marvin's rawness more visible by contrast. It wasn't a perfect duet. It was something more honest than that. Halfway through the song, there was a moment. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and it was visible if you knew how to look for it. A pause in Marvin's voice that wasn't written into any arrangement. A fractional hesitation that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with a man standing at the edge of something. Diana heard it. He knew she heard it because she moved half a step closer to him, and her voice filled the space where his had wavered, not to cover it, but to hold it, the way you put your hand under someone's arm when you feel them start to stumble. He finished the song. The applause was enormous, and it lasted a long time, and Marvin stood in it with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing faces do in those moments. Gratitude, warmth, the gestures of a man receiving something he is glad to receive. Diana took his hand and they stood together at the edge of the stage, and the lights were very bright, and the noise was overwhelming, and from the outside it must have looked like triumph. The curtain came down. Marvin let go of Diana's hand. He turned toward the exit at the side of the stage and he walked. Not quickly, not dramatically, just directly, the way a man walks when he has decided where he is going and has run out of reasons to delay. His road manager fell into step beside him, saying things about the encore, about the press waiting, about the car. Marvin kept walking. Diana called his name once. It was quiet under the noise of the crowd still going in the hall, and it wasn't a question exactly, just his name, said in a way that meant, "I'm here if you need to stop." He didn't stop. He walked down the corridor and through the door and into the cold air of the loading dock, and he stood there alone for a while with the sound of New York around him and the smell of the city coming in off the street. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried since the phone call 4 years ago, and he wasn't going to start now in a loading dock in Manhattan. But he stood there for a long time, longer than he probably should have, and he thought about the 3 seconds in the middle of the song where his voice had gone somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. He thought about Diana stepping closer. He thought about Tammi in a Virginia hospital, thin and tired and looking at him with eyes that already knew how this ended. He thought about how it was possible to stand on a stage in front of 30,000 people and sing a song about love and feel more alone than you had felt all day in a room by yourself. He thought about how the song had sounded anyway, how even broken things can still make that sound. He went back inside eventually. He did the press. He smiled in the photographs. The reviews the next morning would describe a triumphant return, a man fully back in possession of his gifts. Diana gave one interview before leaving the building. When the reporter asked her what it had been like to share the stage with Marvin, she said it had been wonderful. She said he was one of the most gifted singers she had ever known. She said all of this with a warmth that was entirely genuine. She didn't mention the 3 seconds in the middle of the song. Some things you keep. Marvin left New York the next morning without speaking to her. They would see each other again over the years. At industry events, at funerals, at gatherings the music business holds to remind itself of its own significance. They would always be kind. They would always be careful. But neither of them ever talked about that night at the Garden. Not to each other, not to anyone. There are nights that belong only to the people who were inside them, and this was one of those nights. A stage, 2 voices, 30,000 people who thought they understood what they were watching. A man who walked off into a loading dock and stood in the cold and thought about a woman who had died 4 years earlier, and whose name he still couldn't say out loud without something in his chest doing something he had no word for. The song had sounded beautiful. It had sounded the way it always sounded, which was like a promise that everything would be fine, that nothing was too high or too wide or too deep to cross when you had someone beside you. Marvin had stood there and sung it anyway. That was the only kind of courage he knew how to practice. Not the courage of believing the words, but the courage of singing them in front of 30,000 people while knowing, in some room inside yourself where the lights don't reach, that you stopped believing them a long time ago. He sang anyway. He always sang anyway. That was the whole of it. The car that took him back to the hotel that night was quiet. His road manager sat in the front and didn't turn around. The city moved past the windows, the lights, the bridges, the ordinary late-night traffic of a place that doesn't stop for anyone's grief. Marvin looked out the window and thought about the first time he had heard that song. It had been 1967. Nick Ashford had played the demo over the phone, and even through the receiver the melody had done something to him. Something about the arrangement, the way it built, the particular promise embedded in the words. No mountain high enough, no valley low enough. He had understood immediately why it was a duet. The song didn't work alone. It required 2 voices because the point of it was that someone else was there. The voice that reaches and the voice that answers. The proof that you are not singing into empty air. He had called Tammi to tell her he loved the song. She had laughed and said she already knew they were going to record it. She always knew things like that before he told her. He pressed his fingers against the cold glass of the window. In the hotel room, he sat on the edge of the bed and didn't turn on the television and didn't call anyone. After a while, he picked up the guitar he always traveled with and played the opening chords of the song very slowly, just the structure of it, stripped of everything except the intervals. It sounded like something that had happened a long time ago, and also like something that was still happening. He played it once through, and then set the guitar against the wall, and lay back and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, there were flowers from Diana at the front desk. No note, just flowers, chosen carefully, saying something without saying anything. He stood there holding them for a moment in the hotel lobby with his bag at his feet and his car waiting outside. And he thought that this was perhaps the most honest thing that had passed between them. Not the conversation in the dressing room, not the song, not the hand-holding at the edge of the stage. Just this. Just the acknowledgement that the night had been something, even if neither of them had the language for exactly what. He left them at the front desk and walked out into the morning. New York was cold and bright and completely indifferent to him, which was a relief. He got in the car and the city fell away behind him. Somewhere behind him, the garden was already being set up for the next event. By tonight, the stage would belong to someone else entirely. That was the nature of stages. They don't hold on to you. You leave, and the space closes around your absence like water. Marvin had known that for a long time. He had just needed once more to stand inside the light and find out if he could still make the sound. He could. For now, that was enough.